Police officer humiliates a man, but what she didn't know was that he was a renowned judge. The streets of Brooklyn pulsed with their usual rhythm, a mix of bustling pedestrians, distant music spilling from open windows, and the occasional wail of a siren slicing through the humid night air. Officer Grace Wilson sat in her cruiser, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel as she scanned her surroundings. It was her 4th year on the force, and while she took pride in the badge, there was an undercurrent of frustration she couldn't shake. Lately, her shifts had felt more like playing a game of whack-a-mole, putting out fires without ever addressing the root of the problem. The police radio crackled to life, breaking her train of thought. Unit 3-2, report of a suspicious vehicle in your area, possible connection to a stolen car. Plate reads, New York 854, Bravo Delta Lima. Grace's eyes narrowed as she glanced at her laptop. Her patrol car's automated license plate reader had already pinged a match earlier, just a block away. The alert lined up with the dispatcher's call. "Copy that. I'll check it out," she replied, shifting the car into gear. The vehicle in question was a sleek black Mercedes-Benz, parked neatly along the curb outside a modest brownstone. It looked out of place, almost too polished for the area. Grace pulled up behind it, her hand instinctively moving to her body camera, ensuring it was on and recording. She stepped out of the cruiser, her boots crunching against the asphalt as she approached the driver's side window. Inside sat a man, calm and composed. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable as he glanced at her approach. His deep brown skin gleamed under the streetlight, and his neatly cropped hair gave him an air of refinement. Grace cleared her throat. "Sir, can you roll down your window, please?" The man complied, his movements deliberate. He kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer. How can I help you?" His tone was polite, but carried a weight that made Grace's stomach tighten. She pulled her flashlight from her belt, shining it into the car. "This vehicle matches the description of a car reported stolen. Can I see your license, registration, and proof of insurance?" The man arched a brow, his composure unwavering. "Stolen, you say? That's surprising." He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and produced his wallet. "Here's my license." Grace scrutinized the ID, Thomas Brown. The name didn't ring a bell. She scanned the address. Upper West Side, Manhattan. The kind of neighborhood where luxury cars were as common as corner delis. "Registration and insurance," she pressed, her voice firmer than intended. "I'd like to retrieve them from the glove compartment, if that's all right," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Go ahead." "Slowly," she said, her hand hovering near her holster. Brown retrieved the documents and handed them over. Grace stepped back to run the plates and verify the information. As the computer processed the request, a familiar dread crept over her. The plate number was a match for a stolen vehicle, but something about the situation didn't feel right. She returned to the car, her tone clipped. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Brown let out a measured sigh. "Officer, I've cooperated fully. Is there a reason for this escalation?" "Step out of the car," Grace repeated, her grip tightening on her flashlight. "I'm following protocol." The man opened the door and stepped out, his tall frame towering over Grace. Despite the tension in the air, his movements were steady and calm. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," she ordered. "Is this really necessary?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was a hint of steel beneath it. Grace didn't answer. She began to pat him down, her hands methodical. The radio chatter in her ear faded into white noise as her focus zeroed in on the task. She was running on autopilot, her training guiding her every move. Then came the sound of approaching footsteps. "Officer Wilson, what's going on here?" called a voice from behind her. It was Officer Ruiz, her partner for the shift, arriving as backup. The sight of another officer seemed to draw a small crowd of onlookers from the nearby stoop. possible stolen vehicle," Grace replied curtly, motioning toward the Mercedes. Ruiz gave Brown a once-over, his brow furrowing. "You sure about that? This guy doesn't exactly look like your average car thief." Grace bristled at the comment. "The system flagged the plates. I'm just doing my job." But before she could say more, Brown cleared his throat. "If you're done, officer, I'd like to speak now." The crowd had grown, murmurs rippling through it. Grace's unease deepened. "Go ahead," she said, her voice steady but her confidence shaken. Brown adjusted his tie and looked Grace directly in the eye. "I am Judge Thomas Brown of the New York Supreme Court. This car is mine, and I think we have a serious misunderstanding." Duh! The words hit Grace like a slap. Her stomach churned as she struggled to process what he'd just said. Ruiz's eyes widened in recognition. "Wait, Judge Brown?" Ruiz muttered. "I've seen him on TV. Oh, man." Grace's heart sank. The tension in the air shifted, the murmurs in the crowd growing louder. She opened her mouth to respond, but the weight of the moment rendered her speechless. Judge Brown's voice cut through the chaos, calm but firm. "I think it's time we address what's really happening here, Officer Wilson, because this isn't just about a car." The crowd's murmurs grew louder as Judge Thomas Brown's declaration hung in the humid night air. Grace Wilson's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had heard his words clearly, but they didn't seem real. A judge, a New York Supreme Court judge. Her partner, Officer Ruiz, was the first to speak. Judge Brown, I think there's been a misunderstanding here," he stammered, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. His face betrayed a mixture of panic and recognition. Brown turned his steady gaze toward Ruiz. "A misunderstanding? That's putting it lightly." His voice was even, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. He glanced back at Grace. "Officer Wilson, I'd like to hear your explanation." Grace swallowed hard, struggling to maintain her composure. "The system flagged the plates as belonging to a stolen vehicle. I was following protocol." Brown tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And was it protocol to assume I was guilty before you had all the facts?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of yet another patrol car. A sergeant stepped out, his uniform crisp even in the late hour. Sergeant O'Connell was known for his no-nonsense demeanor, and his eyes quickly scanned the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his gaze shifting between Grace, Ruiz, and the judge. Ruiz stepped forward, clearly eager to defuse the situation. "The plates on this car matched a stolen vehicle report, Sarge, but, it belongs to Judge Thomas Brown." O'Connell's expression shifted immediately. He walked up to Brown, extending a hand. "Your Honor, I apologize for the inconvenience. This is highly unusual, and we'll sort it out immediately." Brown did not take the hand. Instead, he crossed his arms, his presence commanding. "What's unusual, Sergeant, is being treated as a suspect simply for sitting in my own car. You might want to reconsider what constitutes protocol." O'Connell's jaw tightened. "Let's get those plates checked again. There must be some kind of error." Grace, still standing by the car, tried to ignore the heat rising to her face. She wanted to disappear, but the crowd made that impossible. Phones were out now, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Minutes later, the results came back. The car was, in fact, Brown's. The plates had been cloned, a common tactic used by car thieves to avoid detection. Grace felt a momentary wave of relief at the confirmation, but it was short-lived. The facts didn't erase the way she had conducted the stop, the rigid tone she'd used, or the assumptions she hadn't realized she'd made. Brown looked at her again, his expression a mix of disappointment and something more profound: exhaustion. "Officer Wilson, I don't believe you intended to escalate this situation, but that doesn't absolve you of how it was handled. Do you understand that?" Grace nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I could file a complaint. I could make a very public issue out of this, but I'm not going to, at least not in the way you think. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Grace didn't know whether to feel grateful or uneasy. Brown turned to address the sergeant. I'm going home. I've had enough for one evening, but I'd like to have a formal conversation about this, and not just about tonight. O'Connell nodded quickly. Of course, Your Honor. We'll be in touch. Brown glanced at Grace one last time before getting into his car. His demeanor was calm, but the unspoken message was clear. This was far from over. The crowd began to disperse as the Mercedes pulled away, but the tension lingered in the air. Grace exhaled shakily, her hands trembling slightly. Ruiz approached her, his voice low. You okay? She nodded, though the answer was far from true. Yeah, I just didn't expect that. Ruiz shrugged, his tone almost casual. You're not the first to mess up on a stop. At least he didn't press charges. That's not the point, Grace snapped, surprising herself with the sharpness of her tone. She could feel Ruiz staring at her, but she didn't meet his gaze. O'Connell walked over, his expression unreadable. Wilson, I need you to write up a full report, tonight, and expect a follow-up. This won't be swept under the rug. Grace nodded, her stomach sinking. She knew this wasn't just about paperwork. This was about her career, and something much bigger than herself. The precinct was eerily quiet that night as Grace sat at her desk, staring at the blank incident report on her computer screen. The hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers from another officer were the only sounds in the room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain what had happened without exposing the glaring gaps in her own judgment? She leaned back in her chair, replaying the night's events over and over. The look in Judge Brown's eyes stayed with her, more than his words. It wasn't anger that had unsettled her. It was the quiet, deliberate disappointment, the weight of 1,000 other moments she would never fully understand. Wilson. Sergeant O'Connell's voice cut through the silence. Grace turned to see him standing in the doorway to his office, motioning for her to come in. She rose slowly, her stomach twisting into knots. As she stepped inside, O'Connell gestured for her to sit. He closed the door behind her and took a seat opposite her at his desk, his expression unreadable. Let's get straight to it, he said. What happened tonight is already on its way up the chain. Judge Brown didn't file a formal complaint yet, but he made it clear he wants to have a conversation about this. And it's not just about you, Wilson. It's about how we do things as a department. Grace nodded, unsure of what to say. O'Connell leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. Look, I've known you for a while. You're a good cop, but tonight, you screwed up. You handled that stop by the book, sure, but you also let bias creep in. Whether you realize it or not, that's what Brown is calling out. I wasn't biased, Grace said quickly, her voice defensive. I followed the protocol. The plates matched. The plates were cloned, O'Connell interrupted, his tone sharp. And you treated him like a criminal from the moment you approached the car. Did you even stop to think about why? Or was it just instinct? Grace's face burned. She wanted to argue, to push back, but the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew he wasn't wrong. I'll admit I was tense, she said finally. But I wasn't thinking about his race. I was thinking about the report, the stolen car. Were you? O'Connell's gaze was piercing. Or were you thinking about what you expected to find when you walked up to that car? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. O'Connell sighed and leaned back in his chair. Here's the deal. You're going to finish that report, and you're going to be honest. No spin, no excuses. Then you're going to meet with Brown. He's asked for you specifically, said he wants to discuss solutions. Solutions? Grace asked, confused. Yeah, solutions. Apparently the judge is interested in turning this into a learning experience for everyone, you included. Grace frowned. And if I don't agree? O'Connell's expression hardened. You don't have a choice. If you want to keep your badge, you'll show up, you'll listen, and you'll learn. Are we clear? She nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. The meeting was scheduled 2 days later in a conference room at the courthouse. Grace arrived early, her nerves frayed. She wore her full uniform, polished and immaculate, hoping it might give her some semblance of confidence. It didn't. When Judge Brown entered the room, he was flanked by a few staff members, including a woman with a clipboard who appeared to be taking notes. Brown gave Grace a nod, then sat across from her at the long table. The others remained standing along the wall, silent observers. Officer Wilson, Brown began, his tone calm but firm. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Grace swallowed hard. Of course, Your Honor. He studied her for a moment before continuing. Let me be clear about something. I'm not here to destroy your career. I could have filed a formal complaint, and it likely would have been the end of your time on the force. But that's not what I want. Grace blinked, surprised by his directness. Then what do you want? I want change, he said simply. Not just from you, but from the system you represent. And that starts with understanding why what happened the other night isn't just a one-off mistake. It's part of a pattern that I and countless others have been forced to live with. Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't that kind of cop. But something in his tone stopped her. This wasn't about her feelings or her intentions. It was about the impact of her actions. Brown continued. You're going to participate in a program I've been working on for a while. It's focused on addressing implicit bias within law enforcement. And I'm not just asking you to attend, I want you to help shape it. Grace's eyes widened. Shape it? Why me? Because you're exactly the kind of officer this program is designed to reach, he said bluntly. You're dedicated, you care about your job, and you want to do the right thing, but you also have blind spots. And unless those blind spots are addressed, they'll keep leading to moments like the one we had. Grace was silent, her mind racing. The idea of being singled out for something like this felt overwhelming, almost humiliating. But beneath that was a flicker of something else, curiosity. Could she really learn from this? Could she help others do the same? I don't know if I'm the right person for this, she admitted. Brown's expression softened slightly. The fact that you're willing to admit that tells me you are. Grace sat in the precinct locker room, staring at the badge in her hand. It felt heavier than usual. The past few days had been a blur of paperwork, awkward interactions with her colleagues, and sleepless nights replaying the confrontation with Judge Brown. She still couldn't decide whether she was angry at herself, at him, or at the entire situation. The sound of the locker room door swinging open snapped her out of her thoughts. Officer Ruiz stepped in, his expression cautious. You okay? He asked, leaning against a nearby bench. Grace gave a half-hearted shrug. Been better. Ruiz hesitated before speaking again. I heard about the meeting with the judge. Sounds like he's giving you a second chance. Grace frowned. A second chance to do what? Be his pet project? Maybe, Ruiz said with a small smirk, but it could be worse. He could have buried you. Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. I just don't know what he expects from me. He wants me to help create some bias training program, like I'm an expert or something. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. Well, maybe that's the point. You're not an expert, but you've got something most people don't. Experience. Grace scoffed. Experience making mistakes, you mean? Yeah, Ruiz said, shrugging. And if you can learn from them, maybe you can help others do the same. His words stuck with her as she walked to the courthouse later that afternoon for her second meeting with Judge Brown. This time she wasn't in uniform. Instead, she wore a simple blazer and slacks, hoping to appear more approachable, or at least less defensive. When she entered the conference room, Brown was already there, seated at the same spot as before. He glanced up from his notes and nodded at her. "Officer Wilson," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Grace," she corrected. "You can call me Grace." Brown smiled faintly. "Grace, then. Please have a seat." She sat across from him, feeling a little less tense than the last time. Still, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "I've been reviewing some of your reports from the past year," Brown began, his tone measured. "You're thorough, by the book. But do you ever ask yourself why the book says what it does?" Grace frowned, unsure how to respond. I guess I've never thought about it that way. The protocols are there for a reason, right? To keep us safe, to make sure we're doing things the right way." "And what happens when the protocols are flawed?" Brown countered. "Or when they're applied in ways that disproportionately affect certain communities?" Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't think that's what I was doing." "Not intentionally, perhaps," Brown said. "But that's the problem with implicit bias. It's not always intentional, and unless we address it, we end up perpetuating harm without even realizing it." She let his words sink in, feeling a pang of defensiveness, but also a flicker of understanding. "So what do you want me to do? Just admit I'm biased and move on?" Brown shook his head. "No, I want you to help me create a program that confronts these issues head-on. One that doesn't just lecture officers about bias, but gives them the tools to recognize it and overcome it. And I want your perspective, your honesty." Grace hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." "You are," Brown said firmly, "because you're willing to ask questions. You're willing to be uncomfortable, and that's where real change starts." Over the next few weeks, Grace found herself immersed in a world she had never thought much about. Brown invited her to attend workshops, listen to community members' stories, and sit in on discussions about systemic bias in law enforcement. It was overwhelming at first, and there were moments when she wanted to walk away. But each time, she forced herself to stay. One workshop, in particular, left a lasting impression. A young black man named Jamal shared his story of being stopped by police more than a dozen times before his 18th birthday. "I stopped seeing them as protectors," he said, his voice trembling. "I started seeing them as predators." Grace felt a lump in her throat as she listened. She thought about the look on Brown's face the night she had stopped him, and realized how many others must have felt the same way. Eventually, Grace began contributing to the program's development. She worked closely with Brown, sharing her own experiences and helping to design scenarios that would challenge officers to think critically about their actions. The program was unlike anything she had ever seen, dynamic, practical, and brutally honest. One evening, as they wrapped up a planning session, Brown turned to her with a rare smile. "You've come a long way, Grace," she shrugged, trying to downplay it. "I still have a lot to learn." "We all do," Brown said. "But the important thing is that you're willing to learn, and that's more than most people can say." The first session of the pilot program for implicit bias training was set to take place in one of the precinct's conference rooms. Grace stood by the door, clutching a folder filled with talking points and slides she had reviewed a dozen times. Despite weeks of preparation with Judge Brown, her nerves were frayed. As the room filled with her fellow officers, the atmosphere became palpably tense. Conversations were hushed but pointed, and she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Some of the officers she knew well, others only in passing, but all of them looked at her with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and outright defiance. "You're really doing this, huh?" a voice said from behind her. Grace turned to see Officer Daniels, a veteran cop with 20 years on the force. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. "Yeah," Grace said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I am." Daniels shrugged. "Well, good luck. Not sure you'll change any minds, though. People don't like being told they're the problem." Grace swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, Judge Brown entered the room, carrying an air of calm authority that immediately commanded attention. He greeted a few people with polite nods before taking his place at the front of the room. "Good morning," Brown began, his deep voice steady but firm. "Thank you all for being here. I know this isn't easy. Change rarely is, but the fact that you've shown up means you're willing to try, and that's the first step." Grace joined him at the front, her palms sweating. Brown gave her a small nod, silently encouraging her to take the lead. She cleared her throat, glancing down at her notes before looking up at the room. "I know what some of you are thinking," she began. "You're thinking, why am I here? I don't need this. And honestly, I get it. I used to think the same thing. But then I made a mistake that could have cost someone their dignity or worse. That's why I'm here, to learn, and to help you learn too." The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of a chair or cough. Grace felt her confidence waver but pressed on. "This isn't about accusing anyone of being racist or saying you're a bad cop," she continued. "It's about recognizing the biases we all carry, biases we may not even realize we have, and figuring out how to address them before they affect the people we've sworn to protect." As the session progressed, the officers engaged reluctantly at first, their questions tinged with defensiveness. "What about the bias against cops?" one officer asked. "The public treats us like we're the enemy." Brown stepped in smoothly. "That's a valid concern, and it's one we can't ignore. But the difference is, as officers, we have power that comes with responsibility. If we misuse that power, intentionally or not, the consequences can be devastating." Another officer raised their hand. "So what are we supposed to do? Second-guess every decision we make in the field?" Grace jumped in, finding her footing. "No, it's not about second-guessing, it's about being aware. Taking a moment to check your assumptions before you act. That awareness can make all the difference." By the end of the session, the room's atmosphere had shifted slightly. Some officers still looked unconvinced, but others seemed to be reflecting on what they'd heard. Grace couldn't help but notice Daniels, who had been skeptical earlier, nodding quietly during one of Brown's stories. After the session, Grace lingered in the room, gathering her materials. Brown approached her, a small smile on his face. "You did well," he said. "Thanks," Grace replied, though she didn't quite believe it. "I don't know if I got through to anyone." "You got through to some," Brown said, "and that's more than most people manage on their first try." Back at the precinct, the reaction to the training was mixed. Some officers grumbled about woke politics invading their work, while others admitted, albeit grudgingly, that it had given them something to think about. Grace overheard one officer saying, "Maybe Wilson's not so bad after all," and felt a small flicker of pride. But the skepticism wasn't limited to her colleagues. The program attracted criticism from external sources, including local news outlets and police unions, which painted it as unnecessary or even harmful. Grace found herself in the crossfire, her name mentioned in articles and debates. The scrutiny was exhausting, but Brown's steady support kept her grounded. "You're doing the right thing," he told her after one particularly brutal news segment. "Change is never easy, and it's never popular, but it's always worth it." A brisk autumn wind swept through the streets of Brooklyn as Grace exited her patrol car, responding to a call about a suspicious vehicle parked outside a school. It was the kind of call that once would have felt routine, but now, after months of training sessions, workshops, and countless hard conversations, Grace approached it differently. She slowed her pace, taking in the scene. The car, An older model sedan with a dented bumper sat idling near the curb. Inside, a young man with dreadlocks and a hoodie sat behind the wheel, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. A woman stood nearby, her phone pressed to her ear, glancing nervously at the vehicle. Grace approached the woman first, her voice calm. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's going on?" The woman, middle-aged and flustered, pointed at the car. "I don't know if he belongs here. He's just been sitting there for a while and it made me nervous." Grace nodded, keeping her tone neutral. "Has he done anything threatening?" The woman hesitated. "No, but you hear about these things, you know. I just thought someone should check it out." Grace felt a pang of frustration, but kept it in check. She thanked the woman and approached the car. The young man watched her warily as she approached, his body tense. Grace tapped on the window lightly, then stepped back to give him space. When he rolled it down, she smiled. "Hi, I'm Officer Wilson. Can I ask what you're doing here?" The man looked at her cautiously. "Waiting for my little brother. He's at basketball practice." Grace nodded. "Got it. Do you have your ID on you?" He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, not at all," Grace said quickly, keeping her tone even. "Someone was just concerned because you've been sitting here for a while. I just need to confirm that everything's okay." The man sighed and handed over his ID. "Jerome Carter," he said. "I live 2 blocks from here." Grace glanced at the ID and handed it back. "Thanks, Jerome. Sorry to bother you. Your brother's lucky to have someone looking out for him." Jerome's posture softened slightly. "Thanks. Officer Wilson, right?" "That's right," she said with a nod. "You have a good night, okay?" Jerome nodded and rolled up his window. Grace walked back to the woman, who was still lingering near the scene. "Everything's fine," Grace said gently. "He's just waiting for his brother. Next time, it might help to get a little more information before calling us, okay?" The woman nodded, looking embarrassed. "I just didn't want to take any chances." Grace forced a small smile. "I understand, but sometimes we can cause more harm by assuming the worst." The interaction lingered in her mind as she drove back to the precinct. A year ago, she might have approached Jerome's car with suspicion, her hand near her holster. Tonight, she had approached with curiosity and calm. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Later that week, Grace found herself back in the training room, this time leading a session solo. Judge Brown had encouraged her to take the reins, and while she was nervous, she also felt ready. The room was full of officers, some familiar, some new. As she spoke, Grace shared the story of her encounter with Jerome, breaking it down step by step to illustrate how her approach had changed. "It's not about being perfect," she told the group. "It's about being mindful, about asking yourself, what assumptions am I making right now, and how might they affect my actions? That one question can change everything." The officers listened intently, and for the first time, Grace felt like they weren't just humoring her, they were actually engaging with the material. One officer raised his hand. "What do you do when you realize you've made the wrong assumption?" "You own it," Grace said simply, "and you do better next time. That's all any of us can do." By the end of the session, Grace felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't the kind of adrenaline rush that came from making an arrest or stopping a crime. It was quieter, deeper, a feeling that she was helping to build something that mattered. After the session, Daniels approached her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Wilson, I wasn't sure about all this at first, but you're making a difference. I can see it." Grace smiled, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks, Daniels. That means a lot." "Don't let it go to your head," he said with a smirk, but there was no mistaking the respect in his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Grace continued to lead sessions, each one building on the last. The skepticism she had faced in the beginning hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened. More and more, her colleagues were starting to see the value in what she and Judge Brown were trying to achieve. One night, after a particularly long shift, she found herself sitting in her car outside the precinct, staring at the city skyline. The path she had taken over the past months hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud, not just of her work, but of who she was becoming. The precinct was buzzing with activity as Grace arrived for her shift. A wave of energy seemed to ripple through the department, but she couldn't quite place why. As she settled into her desk, Officer Daniels walked by, grinning. "You're the talk of the day," he said. Grace blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Daniels handed her a folded newspaper. "Page 2. Grace unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the bold headline, "Brooklyn Officer Leads Reform Training, Making Waves in NYPD." Her heart skipped a beat as she skimmed the article. It highlighted the implicit bias program she and Judge Brown had developed, calling it a groundbreaking step toward trust and accountability in law enforcement. The writer even mentioned her name, noting her pivotal role in designing and leading the sessions. "I didn't even know they were writing this," Grace said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Daniel shrugged. "Word gets around when you're making a difference. Congrats, Wilson. You earned it." She wasn't sure if she felt pride or panic. Public recognition was new to her, and the idea of being in the spotlight made her stomach churn. But as the day went on, she noticed a shift in how her colleagues treated her. Officers who had been skeptical or dismissive of her efforts were now offering nods of respect or stopping by to share a kind word. That evening, Grace found herself at a community meeting hosted at a local recreation center. Judge Brown had invited her to attend, and she agreed, albeit reluctantly. She wasn't sure how the public would receive her after the article, but Brown insisted it was important. The room was packed with community members of all ages and backgrounds. Grace scanned the crowd, her nerves prickling. She spotted Jerome, the young man she'd encountered outside the school, sitting near the front with a younger boy who she guessed was his brother. Brown stepped to the podium, addressing the crowd with his usual poise. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're here to discuss not only the challenges we face as a community, but the solutions we can build together. And I'd like to introduce someone who's been instrumental in one such solution, Officer Grace Wilson." Applause filled the room as Brown gestured for Grace to join him. She hesitated for a moment before walking to the podium, her pulse pounding. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "I'll be honest," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "When Judge Brown first approached me about this program, I didn't think I was the right person for the job. I had made mistakes that hurt people, but he showed me that acknowledging those mistakes was the first step toward doing better." She paused, scanning the room. "This program isn't about fixing everything overnight. It's about starting a conversation, about building trust, one interaction at a time, and I want you to know that we're listening." The crowd erupted into applause again, and Grace felt a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. As she stepped away from the podium, Jerome approached her, his younger brother in tow. "Officer Wilson," Jerome said, extending a hand, "thanks for what you said. It means a lot." Grace shook his hand, smiling. "Thank you, Jerome, for giving us a chance." The real test came a week later. Grace and Ruiz were dispatched to another call involving a stolen car. As they arrived at the scene, she felt a sense of déjà vu. The vehicle, a black SUV, was parked outside a convenience store, its engine running. A man was inside, rummaging through the glove compartment. Ruiz was already reaching for his radio when Grace stopped him. "Wait," she said, "let me try something." She approached the vehicle, her posture relaxed but alert. The man inside looked up, startled, as she tapped on the window. He rolled it down, his hands trembling. "Hey there," Grace said, her tone calm. "Mind telling me what's going on?" The man hesitated before stammering, "It's my cousin's car. I borrowed it to grab something from the store." Grace nodded. "Okay. Can I see your ID and the registration for the car?" The man fumbled for his wallet and handed her his ID. Grace checked it against the registration, which was sitting on the passenger seat. Everything matched. "Thanks," Grace said, handing the ID back. "Next time, make sure you let your cousin know you're borrowing the car." "Someone called this in because they thought it looked suspicious." The man exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Will do. Thanks, officer." As Grace walked back to Ruiz, he raised an eyebrow. "Guess that training really stuck, huh?" She smiled faintly. "Guess so." Back at the precinct, word of the interaction spread quickly. Officers who had once doubted her were now acknowledging her growth, and her name was even mentioned during a departmental meeting as an example of effective policing. Sergeant O'Connell approached her after the meeting, his expression uncharacteristically warm. "You've come a long way, Wilson. I'm proud of you." Grace felt a lump in her throat. "Thanks, Sarge. That means a lot." That night, Grace sat in her apartment, reflecting on the past year. She had faced challenges she never could have anticipated, but she had also grown in ways she hadn't thought possible. The work was far from over, but for the first time she felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for the future of policing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Judge Brown. "You're doing good work, Grace. Keep it up." She smiled, setting the phone down and gazing out the window. The city stretched before her, alive with possibility. The morning air was crisp as Grace walked into the community center, where the final session of the pilot training program was being held. The room buzzed with anticipation, filled not just with officers, but also community members, local activists, and even a few city officials. The program had grown beyond her wildest expectations, and tonight's session would mark its official conclusion and the beginning of a broader initiative to expand it citywide. Judge Brown stood near the front of the room, speaking with a group of attendees. He looked up as Grace entered and offered her a warm smile. "Good to see you, Grace." "You too, Your Honor," she said with a grin. "Are we ready for this?" He chuckled. "More than ready. Let's make it count." As the session began, Grace took her place at the front of the room. She scanned the audience, her gaze settling on familiar faces. Daniels, Ruiz, Jerome, and even Sergeant O'Connell, who had come to support her. The weight of their presence grounded her, filling her with a steady resolve. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Over the past few months, we've embarked on a journey, one that hasn't always been easy, but one that I believe has been worth it. We've learned about the power of assumptions, the importance of empathy, and the ways we can build trust within our community." She paused, glancing at Jerome. "A year ago, I wouldn't have believed I'd be standing here today. But I made a mistake that forced me to confront the kind of officer I was and the kind of officer I wanted to be. And I realized that the two weren't the same." The room was silent, the audience hanging on her every word. "This program isn't just about changing policy or checking boxes," she continued. "It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about realizing that the badge we wear isn't just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of service. And service means listening, learning, and holding ourselves accountable." As she wrapped up her speech, the room erupted into applause. Grace stepped back, her heart racing but full. Brown joined her at the front, his smile brimming with pride. "You've done something incredible here," he said quietly. "We've done it," she replied. "Together." In the weeks that followed, the program gained momentum, receiving funding from the city and interest from other precincts across New York. Grace found herself in meetings with policymakers, activists, and even the mayor, discussing ways to integrate the training into standard police protocols. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. each step a small victory in the larger battle for change. One afternoon, as she was reviewing a proposal for expanding the program, her phone buzzed with a call from Ruiz. "Hey, Wilson," he said. "You free tonight? A bunch of us are grabbing drinks, and we figured we'd invite our new department celebrity." Grace laughed. "Celebrity, huh? I don't know about that." "Come on," Ruiz said. "You've earned it." She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "All right, I'll be there." That evening, as Grace walked into the bar, she was greeted with cheers and claps on the back. It was a far cry from the skepticism and resistance she had faced months earlier. Daniels raised a glass in her direction, shouting, "To Wilson, the cop who made us all look good." The group laughed, and Grace felt a wave of warmth and belonging she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months later, Grace stood outside the precinct, watching as a new group of recruits filed in for their first day of training. She smiled, remembering her own first day and how different she had been then. She hoped the program would give these recruits something she hadn't had, a foundation of empathy, awareness, and accountability from the start. As the recruits disappeared into the building, Grace's phone buzzed. It was a message from Judge Brown. "Ready for the next challenge?" Grace grinned, typing back, "Always." She slipped the phone into her pocket and walked toward her car, the city stretching out before her. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt truly equipped to face it, and she wasn't doing it alone. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.